Okay, I think we can go ahead and get started while we wait for people to keep coming in. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Kevin Conklin, and I work for the Center of Effective Global Action in their Cost Transparency Initiative alongside Liz Brown, who is also on the call. We really appreciate everyone coming in for this brown bag lunch and getting to hear from Justin and Michaela about the Dioptra tool. Before passing off to them, I wanted to just share a bit about what CTI is and sort of what our goals are. So, as I mentioned before, the Cost Transparency Initiative is a program within the Center for Effective Global Action housed at UC Berkeley. And our goal really is to encourage the uptake of rigorous and transparent cost analyses and working to break down some of the barriers that exist to prevent the sort of uptake of that. And really we focus on four sort of main key pillars. First is implementing research ourselves. So internally, we do a lot of cost effective analyses alongside impact evaluations. We work to promote best practices, develop tools and trainings, and then also to help foster collaboration across researchers and practitioners in the costing space. And that is something we do through the Costing Community of Practice. Which is a group of about 10 like-minded organizations that come together through various events to sort of share and talk through some of the best practices in the costing space, and also to share work that each of us are doing in costing. So that could include, research. In past events, we've talked about different tools like we will be today, as well as trainings that people have come up with. And so one of the events that we do through this CCOP is this brown bag lunch series. So if this is your first time here, welcome. We try to do these once every other month or so. And really the idea is just to have a forum to bring everyone together who's involved in this space. So as you guys know, today our event is going to be an introduction to Dioptra, which is a costing tool that was developed by a consortium of organizations, but really spearheaded by the IRC. And we have with us today Justin LeVay, who is the Director of Economic Evaluation and Research at IRC. He has a wealth of experience in cost analyses. Prior to coming to IRC, he directed cost effectiveness evals both at Giving Green and GiveWell. And we also have Michaela Cochran, who is a cost advisor at the IRC and also has a large amount of experience in the space. Previously coming from the Center for Evaluation Development in Germany. She has experience both in economic evaluation and impact evaluation in Ethiopia and Pakistan. So we're very excited to host these two and excited to get kicked off. So with that, I will pass it over to Justin.
Thanks very much for the kind intro, Kevin. It's a pleasure to be speaking with you all today, and wonderful to see some familiar faces online as well. So we're very excited to be able to share with you a little bit about what we've been up to, and also to be able to hear more of your questions and your thoughts so that we can all continue to work together to be able to build cost effectiveness, evidence, and use within our respective organizations. So today, we're going to talk about three major buckets of things. The first thing that I want to do is just give you a quick introduction to the IRC and the best use of resources team that focuses on costing evidence in the IRC. Second, I'm going to walk you through Dioptra and talk about how we think about it at the IRC and the work that we've been doing with different partners to be able to expand the use of Dioptra more broadly. And then third, I'm going to hand it over to Michaela to walk us through a complementary example of a cost effectiveness evaluation that she recently conducted alongside different colleagues at the IRC to be able to give you a snapshot of what some of our latest work looks like in practice. So first off, I'm not going to go through this in full detail, but just wanted to give you a sense of what I am talking about when I'm talking about the IRC. We are a fairly large organization. Our annual budget is about $1.5 billion overall and work in 40 different countries. We work across a variety of different sectors. So if you think about your own work, it might overlap with some of those bullets on the right side of the slide, and would be quite interested to think more about how your work relates to our own. So we are fairly sector agnostic, and the thing that really defines us is that we work in areas of crisis, and our clients are those who are affected by crisis. When BER, the Best Use of Resources team, was started in 2015, it was out of a movement of need and confusion and misconception. So humanitarian development needs were growing, financial resources were constrained, and that has essentially only exacerbated since the founding of BER. And at the same time, there were misconceptions about what it means to be an impactful nonprofit organization, or even just a good nonprofit organization trying to do good. People were focused on things like, what is the percentage of overhead that a nonprofit is taking in, or what is the total amount of money that a nonprofit is able to either generate or use in a specific way. And we felt at the time, and when I say we, I really mean the IRC, because I joined 6 months ago and I'm standing on the shoulders of giants for a lot of this work, felt that there was a question to be asked. And it was, what are we actually spending money on? How can we improve the use of the use of those resources to ultimately reach more people and or have more impact? And out of that work over the past 8 years, we've been able to accomplish quite a lot. At the top of this slide, our theory of change basically follows 4 different steps. The first is to actually generate data, to look into budgets, to understand what money we spend and what we are spending it on. With those cost data points, we want to be able to then synthesize the evidence. So it's not enough to just look at one program here, one project there, one country here, but actually to understand what sort of lessons we can possibly learn from that when we think about the broad scope of different data that we have available, and to synthesize it into different lessons. Of course, as you all know, and especially for those who are more in the research realm or the academic realm in the room, if we synthesize that evidence and then it sits in an academic journal or sits on a shelf and gathers dust somewhere, that doesn't really do anything. And so we also take it on as stewards of being able to share that evidence. And initially that meant only within the IRC. So actually synthesizing evidence and working with our country programs and different folks within our organization to actually be able to share some of what we've learned. But increasingly that actually looks beyond the IRC as well. And I'll talk about that momentarily. And then fourth, once we have information sharing and the evidence is out there, how do we actually ensure that the evidence is ultimately used, that people are taking cost considerations or programs are taking cost considerations and applying that so that we can continue to reach more people and have more impact? So to date, we are now in a place where we have conducted over 400 cost efficiency analyses, 30 cost effectiveness analyses, and we really have organizational support for a lot of the resource allocation decisions that are made. Now, that's not to say that, and it should not be the case, that the only thing that is considered is cost evidence for us to make decisions. We are simply one input into broader decisions that the IRC makes around how to spend its money and how to be equitable and fair and thoughtful and rigorous in how it allocates resources. It's just a few examples of different ways in which that cost evidence ultimately works its way into decision making. We have something called cost efficiency guidelines, which I'll give an example of in a bit, but essentially says if your program is focused on latrines, we recommend that you think about reaching this certain scale or having a program that runs these amount of years based on the amount of money that you're trying to spend to be able to maximize the number of years or the number of people reached via your latrine project. The second is actually forward-looking. So oftentimes the trouble with research is that you conduct research, you learn something, and then you're not exactly sure what it applies to in the future. And with cost scenario modeling, we're increasingly trying to create a space for us to be able to ex ante or beforehand actually model out what costs would look like to help inform program design before, perhaps even before a proposal is submitted or a budget is fully developed, and certainly before a program kind of hits the ground and we're spending money. And then the third, and associated with this, is actually bespoke project design and budgeting for either strategic projects where there are a lot of open questions and we really want to probe, or for especially large projects. And we roughly use around $15 million as a cutoff for that, so that we can really dig into the details, because as much as we would like to be able to plug some numbers into a spreadsheet and have something automatically spit out, oftentimes the proof is in the pudding, and we really need to use our team to engage deeply with country program staff or with other stakeholders to understand and develop a program that is really designed and budgeted for with cost evidence in mind. So one of the things that we do within the best use of resources team is Dioptra. We developed Dioptra to be both a tool that we can use to conduct cost efficiency analyses, and as well be a consortium of different member organizations that are also using Dioptra, and increasingly as a movement to be able to talk about cost evidence and to be able to think about ourselves as an advocacy effort, to be able to shift the way that the humanitarian and development sectors are even thinking about cost evidence. So I'll first talk about Dioptra as a tool. On the bottom of the slide, you'll see the basic high-level steps that one would take to be able to go from cost data and program data to ultimately actually getting to the point at which we can view insights. Now, the first thing that I'll say about Dioptra is that it is not meant to be a Ferrari. It is meant to be a Toyota of cost analysis. So that means that Dioptra is only used for cost efficiency. And just to make sure that we're talking about the same thing and that we're all on the same page, cost efficiency is when you're looking at cost per output. So for example, per students reached for an education program, dollars per student reached. Cost effectiveness would be cost per outcome, and for an education project might be something more the lines of dollars per standard deviation increase in math test scores. To be able to run a cost effectiveness evaluation, you need to have that outcome data. And oftentimes that can be difficult to do or expensive to run. And additionally, it's not always necessary. And so in order for Dioptra to be most broadly used and most broadly generalizable, and simple to use, we kept it as purely a cost efficiency tool to make sure to be able to maximize the opportunity set for it, both across the IRC and across the broader humanitarian sector. We also think that cost efficiency itself, though it's not always the solution, and we certainly need to keep cost effectiveness in mind, is oftentimes the most useful thing. And that's for two reasons. One is on the cost side, what we found is that there is actually a lot of opportunity to find cost efficiencies only looking at costs alone. So really digging into those numbers and thinking about how we're spending money and how to reduce those costs. And secondly, if we think about outputs, a lot of the programs that we run do have and should have good, rigorous evidence supporting that program to begin with. So it's not always a question of whether something is ultimately impactful. If we already believe that that program should be impactful, we can focus on cost efficiency instead. And Michaela will give an example of how that's not the case for a cost effectiveness analysis that she recently ran. So I won't go into details on all of these steps, but I'm happy to, in Q&A, hear more about like the specific nitty-gritty that you're most interested in, because I know we've got a lot of folks who are interested in actually running an analysis or hearing more about what this looks like in practice. So very happy to do that. But just wanted to share a couple screenshots to give you a taste of what it actually looks like to run a Dioptra instance. So the two screenshots here are related to getting data into Dioptra and sort of cleaning it or organizing it in a way in which one can actually do analysis. So in one of the questions that someone asked beforehand as part of the signing up for this brown bag lunch, there was a question of how exactly information comes in. And this can happen either via a template spreadsheet or ideally actually be synced to an organization's financial systems. That makes it automatic and makes it relatively seamless to first get information. And the whole point of Dioptra is to be able to do things more rapidly and more rigorously than might otherwise be done. Once that information is in, depending on how it came in, things could be, or different line items could be already automatically categorized to specific sectors or categories. So if you look on the screenshot on the left, for instance, in here, the data pool has automatically categorized some of these line items as national staff or international staff. And some of the areas still need a manual look to be able to actually categorize them further. In this case, this is an unconditional cash transfer program that was part of a larger budget that also include protection work. And so for this, it's important to understand, if we look at the sector, which of these parts was actually related to economic livelihoods and which were related to protection, so that we can uniquely identify the cost for specific livelihoods or cash transfer output that we're interested in. On the right side of the screen, you'll see a contribution, setting the contribution stage. And so in this instance, there are going to be line items that are a part of any sort of grant or program that we run that don't necessarily completely apply to one program. So for example, it's possible that we used a laptop for 10 different programs, or it's possible that there was a staff person that was focused on 2 different programs. And so here you can actually, within Dioptra, allocate a certain percentage of any line item to the program so that we understand exactly how much we should think about if we were to be able to replicate this program. So what comes out of that and what spits out on the other side? Once you put in information and allocated costs accordingly, you get a few kind of basic insights. So on the left side, you can see an example of a top line result. In this instance, for a cash transfer program or a business grant, it costs $557 per person receiving that. $320 of that were the direct project costs, and then $230 of that were shared costs or indirect costs, such as, for example, HQ office staff time, things like that. And we also get some basic insights. So on the right, you'll see an example of a health program where you can see the percentage breakdown among different cost categories. And when you're thinking about how you might want to actually double click and learn more, these sorts of insights give us an example or give us an indication of where we might actually want to start spending our time when we're doing more analysis. So it could be, in this case, that since materials and activities account for 39% of overall costs, it's really worth looking into that a bit more than it might be to look in on office expenses, which only accounted for 5% of total categories. So all of that is Dioptra, the tool. And that's what started back in the day when IRC first developed Dioptra. But that's not where the story ends. And in fact, I think this is just the basis and the foundation for which the really exciting stuff is starting to happen. So now I want to talk about Dioptra, the consortium. Currently, we are a consortium of now 9 NGOs representing a variety of different sectors and activities and geographies, but primarily focused in the humanitarian sector space, all working together to be able to use Dioptra within our own programs and also to be able to share data among us. Collectively, among these 9 NGOs, we roughly account for around $6 billion of spending per year. So are starting to comprise a larger and larger percentage of the total organizations or of the total kind of budget, so to speak, within the sector. But what really is exciting on this too is not just that we are affecting more money, but that we can then actually learn more by sharing data and sharing evidence within our organizations. So on the left side, you'll see an example of a comparison, a simple comparison that would come out immediately upon having conducted a Dioptra tool, where you can see how your program looks against other programs. Now, once again, this is not this is not where the investigation is. This is simply meant to give you a sense of where your program might stand against others, either in terms of geography or scale, and start allowing us to develop more questions and start to probe a little bit more on where we would then actually be able to learn something that might allow us to conduct more cost-effective programs in the future. On the right side, you can see an example of what that collective learning might ultimately lead to. So previously, I mentioned that that IRC has some cost guidance that it gives across all of IRC's programming, and this is an example of that. So in this case, if you look at the chart, there are about 30 different data instances or 30 different projects that were run on cash transfer programs to be able to understand how much it costs to deliver $1 of cash to a client or to a person, and the scale of that project. So on the y-axis, you can see that costs range from around 20 cents of expenses per dollar transferred to a client, up to $3.50 per dollar transferred to a client. And on the x-axis, you can see that projects varied from around 100 clients or 100 households that were reached for some smaller projects, all the way over to about 15,000 households for one of the larger projects included in this. And these data, some of these data are IRC data, and some of these data are not IRC data. And in bringing all of these together, we're actually able to learn more. Looking at this, and based on other analysis that has been done on this, there is a suggestion of kind of a fairly steep drop in prices around once a program reaches 1,000 households. And so our general guidance when IRC country programs are thinking about whether to run a cash transfer program or not is to aim to reach a minimum scale of 1,000 households, because that's where bang for buck might potentially set in. However, that is not to say that if there is a reason to run a program that is less than 1,000 households for cash transfers, that we should not do that. It is also not to say if there is a cash transfer program that we view as quote unquote expensive or at the top of this sort of chart, that is a bad program. This is simply guidance that we give and one consideration that would need to be a part of every program when we're thinking about the trade-offs and the pros and cons to running and designing a project in one way versus another. So where are we headed from here? We have this consortium, we have this tool, we're growing, we're increasingly using the tool, we're building more evidence. And we think at this point, we're excited to really start to be able to say something and to start to have a message to share with the broader sector and with different stakeholders in the area. So on the left side, you can see a few examples of different ways in which we think that we could ultimately, collectively work together for cost evidence to be most useful and for, as a sector, us to reach more people with more impact. On the right side is an example of one of our advocacy outputs, a blog that was published in the Center for Global Development last year that was co-authored by different members of the Dioptra Consortium, really encouraging the broader sector to be thinking about cost effectiveness, not as a compliance requirement, but instead as a learning priority. And as we look toward the year ahead, we're really excited to think more about how we can be a responsible steward of cost evidence and advocate for things that we found to work well and that we think could be useful for the broader sector, and to continue to have more organizations join the consortium, more entities use the Dioptra tool, and for us to collectively continue to expand and work down that theory of change that I mentioned at the very start of this presentation. We'll go into Q&A at the end, but before we do that, I would like to pass it over to Michaela to share a little bit more about cost effectiveness analysis that she recently conducted to give you a sense of what that looks like within the IRC. Thanks.
Thank you, Justin. So I'll be presenting to you a cost analysis conducted by the IRC, and I'll focus on challenges and implications of the analysis. The cost effectiveness work complements what we do in Dioptra for evidence generation, where we have open questions on effectiveness. And it presents a good case study of where questions emerge and challenges that we face during cost analyses. So I'll go over the context of the study, the process we took, outcomes that were observed, and then follow that with challenges, learnings, and next steps. So to set the scene, in the northeastern province of Fufor, Nigeria, livelihoods of agropastoralist communities are frequently disrupted by annual flooding. To reduce the damages experienced by those households, the IRC ran an RCT on anticipatory cash intervention in 2022, which is a type of anticipatory action. Anticipatory action is defined by OCHA as actions that could be taken ahead of predicted hazards to prevent or reduce acute humanitarian impacts before they unfold. Anticipatory actions are quickly gaining traction as a disaster risk management tool. The intervention produced a forecast-based trigger based on hydrometeorological measures that indicate flooding is imminent. When the trigger occurred, households in the pre-shock treatment group received cash before the flooding occurred to provide them resources that would help them mitigate against the damages of the flooding. The research evaluated the effects of distributing cash prior to the onset of flooding as a pre-shock anticipatory cash intervention compared to business as usual distributions of cash after the flooding or post-shock distributions. At the time of the RCT, there was little to no impact data on anticipatory cash actions using experimental designs, and there was no available cost effectiveness evidence on anticipatory cash as an intervention. So the process we used for this evaluation was the following. First, we identified the analysis required, which was an Excel-based activity level analysis doing cost effectiveness analysis. Then we broke apart the intervention into key activities that would help us answer this question of cost effectiveness. This included breaking the intervention into inception, one-time setup activities, and as well as implementation, ongoing repetitive activities that would occur year on year as the system was triggered. We then evaluated how each resource in the budget was used to complete these activities, which helped us arrive at a total cost per activity and subsequently answer the cost question of interest. The outcomes we observed were as follows. Since cost effectiveness analysis evaluates the ratio of cost per unit of impact, we needed first to have impact estimates as well as cost per treatment of unit served. The impact evaluation data showed that anticipatory cash households exhibited improved food security, reduced negative coping strategies, and stability in their productive investments compared to post-shock households. The cost per household showed that during the first year of programming, when we include system setup and anticipatory cash implementation costs, anticipatory cash appeared less cost efficient than business as usual post-shock interventions. However, when we remove the first year of setup costs, we see that cost differences between the two study arms shrinks to a marginally small difference. We removed this first year of setup costs because we wanted to evaluate what a more steady state long-term intervention might look like, since this is a very policy relevant question. So when we evaluated the cost effectiveness of the intervention, we concluded that anticipatory cash is likely to be more cost effective than business as usual interventions when we consider the following information. First, there were positive impact evaluation results when comparing treatment and control. Second, there were moderately small cost differences between treatment and control arms, particularly when we evaluate costs over time. And third, due to the design of the intervention, we were not able to fully disaggregate setup costs per treatment arm. That said, we believe that post-shock costs were actually artificially lower than would be expected. The goal of what I'm presenting to you now is not to get into the details of how we did the analysis, but instead to discuss the implications of the analysis for future data collection. So I'll go into the challenges on the next slide. Conclusions about cost effectiveness are both quantitative and qualitative, and they require transparency about how we define activities and deal with assumptions throughout the analysis. Definitions that we worked through included how stakeholders interpret resource allocation between activities analyzed. This meant putting clear delineations on activities from the start, defining inception versus implementation costs as one-time versus ongoing costs, helped us to distinguish setup from pre and post activities. But in our case, we were also dealing with one-time costs that affected both treatment arms. So we had to make several assumptions during the analysis. One of them was how to distribute these setup costs over the two activities, given that the setup affected both treatment arms. And we had to do this qualitatively, which we then followed up with a sensitivity analysis to evaluate. We also had to make other assumptions about how we'd estimate routine costs that were folded into the RCT. For example, CEAs do not consider or do not include research costs, given that research is not a routine implementation component. However, routine monitoring and evaluation data collection is often folded into end-line data collection for the research itself. So to estimate that, to incorporate that cost, we had to estimate the true cost of what M&E would have looked like apart from research data collection. We learned several things from these challenges. First, we learned that we need to find better ways to disaggregate overlapping costs, such as system setup. We also learned that there is an interest to know how anticipatory actions will impact costs over time and the implication of multi-year funding on such projects. For this, we need to have multi-year funding established and tested so that we can then evaluate it with cost efficiency and cost effectiveness analyses. However, in the interim, we evaluated what cost efficiency might look like over time through an illustrative model of multi-year implementation. Through the model, we can see that even by year 2, the cost efficiency of pre-shock distribution begins to mirror closely that of post-shock business as usual approaches. We also learned that there is a desire by some stakeholders to understand both cost effectiveness as well as cost benefit of the intervention. However, cost benefit analyses answer a different research question that was not originally asked in this research. And we'd also need to address an additional set of assumptions in order to undertake that analysis. So for next steps, despite the work that we have so far, the evidence base for cost efficiency and cost effectiveness of anticipatory action is still incredibly thin. And there's much more work that needs to be done to help inform the design and scale up of these interventions. As we continue to do this at the IRC for upcoming anticipatory action cost analyses, we plan to adjust the setup of our analyses in successive rounds to better disaggregate those setup costs. We also plan to do more scenario models to evaluate how costs might change over time with various changes in programmatic parameters, such as well as increase in reach. And then we also plan to continue investing into the development of cost evidence for anticipatory action through working with other organizations and encouraging comparable costing methods in order to evaluate comparative cost effectiveness of anticipatory action responses. And we also plan to work with other organizations to improve the translation of short-term proxies into longer-term outcomes of anticipatory actions to help us understand the long-term effects of anticipatory action compared to business as usual. So we'll transition back to Justin for discussion, and go ahead.
Thanks very much, Michaela. So we just wanted to share a few discussion prompts here, since I know we covered a lot. We covered what it looks like to be able to have a costing analysis team within an organization. We covered what Dioptra is and how it might apply to your work or how other partners are working on it. And we also specifically talked about a cost effectiveness analysis that we've conducted and what we learned from it. We've listed a few discussion prompts here, and also welcome additional questions for anyone who has anything specific they would like to talk about. And I'll just open up, let's see, the chat now, to see what popped in there as well. Okay, so there's a question on doing analyses in currencies other than USD from Claire Andere. I think that currently, and I apologize that I may not have the full answer here, and so Michaela, also feel free to jump in. One of the nice things about Dioptra is that it does ultimately ensure like a standard comparable system and way in which we can very easily, without having to worry about, did we use this methodology, or are we putting data in a different way or manipulating a different way, it allows that to be baked into the actual tool. It's a good idea to be able to have multi-currency conversion be a part of that. I think that isn't currently a part of it because of that desire to standardize. Though one of the things I'll note on this as well is that Dioptra should not be restrictive in what one can do. We would never want to create a situation where once data goes in, it's stuck in Dioptra on this online tool and you can't really do anything with it. So there's also an export feature that you can use at the end of the day to be able to, for example, do something like what Michaela mentioned, more sensitivity analyses, play around with information more, convert to currency. So that would be a way in which you could do something like that in the meantime. Lainey asked a question about cost efficiency guidance and whether that's the same thing as cost benchmarking. That's a really great question. And we are moving away from the term benchmarking and moving towards the term cost efficiency guidance. It may be semantics at the end of the day, but I think what we want to make sure that we're not doing is accidentally implying too much of a stick or of a hard line in the sand to the cost work that we're doing. And we think that cost efficiency guidance is actually more representative of that. Even in so much as we do, and we are constantly advocating for increased use of cost evidence and the thoughtfulness of that, at the end of the day, it would be a terrible situation if we were to create a benchmark that ultimately was viewed as overly prescriptive and resulted in, for example, an inequitable allocation of resources or something that would cut off programs or services in a way that would ultimately be overly negative. And so we're using the term cost efficiency guidance increasingly versus cost benchmarking.
I can speak to the next one that Lonnie has in there about challenges faced when converting raw accounting data into cost data usable by Dioptra. Just to keep in mind, all data that is entered, whether it's by a finance team or whomever, it always is prone to error. So we always make sure that we have conversations with finance teams or project teams, understand what is actually being entered into the system. So in terms of challenges, that induces a little bit of a time suck on behalf of our team as well as everyone else, but it does ensure that we have the most accurate data so we can understand what is actually going into the system. I'd say that that's probably the largest challenge, is making sure we understand and have the most accurate data, and it just requires a back and forth exchange between our teams and the finance teams.
Thanks, Michaela. Just to jump back in then on the next question from Jane. So the Dioptra tool can both capture and measure costs post-implementation, and that's oftentimes, to be honest, how it's most used. The good part about that is those are actual numbers. And so when we're conducting an analysis, we are able to have everything in place, have the budget finalized, know what the outputs are, and then do that. However, there is an option as well to be able to do everything ex ante or beforehand and simply have everything, all the information in there be projections to be able to understand what that would look like as well. So it can be used for both purposes. But since, as I mentioned, Dioptra is a Toyota, it is not, when you're doing ex ante analysis and putting information into it that is not necessarily real information yet, it isn't highly intuitive to be able to run a bunch of different sensitivity analysis or things like that within Dioptra. That's a little clunky, and so it's most often used ex post. For how costs might change over time. No. So once again, yeah, this would be something that would exist primarily outside of Dioptra. The way, there are kind of two things that I could say for how one might do this within Dioptra. One would be going in and changing the data and understanding then what comes out of that. And then the other is simply looking not so much at how playing around with one project, but looking at how it compares to other projects. So for example, you can look at project A that reached 1,000 households and project B that reached 5,000 households, and that might give you a sense of different economies of scale. But a lot of that more detailed analysis would happen outside. Question on opportunities for institutional learning within the consortium. So I think we've done some of this in the past and are really excited to ramp this up more in the future. So at our last board meeting, we voted to be able to, by default, be able to see more information across all the different projects that we're all working on, to be able to start to ask those questions immediately and learn from each other about different programs and projects that we're working on, which is really exciting, and increased transparency both within the consortium and within the broader sector, I think is really an enabling factor for so much of the conversation and so much of the institutional learning that might otherwise happen. We've done this ad hoc in the past by simply having conversations and agreeing to collectively pool our information together, and then analyze that more intensively to understand what variation might affect. So the cash transfer guidance is a great example of trying to think about what is really driving cost there, and is there a certain scale that we want to try to generally be encouraging across different organizations. Michaela, do you want to take the question on diopter accounting for costs for missing data?
Okay, yeah, so we can add, actually, I'm not quite certain if we can add costs in manually for dioptra. That is something we might just need to check on. Yes, that would be my answer.
Great, yeah, yeah, I think that's right, and could certainly like go back and add it in by importing the data again with missing data. But I don't, yeah, I think Michaela is right that there isn't a way to simply click like add new line item further down the line. Yes, we're very excited to have done 40 CEAs as well. That's great. And are we able to use data to inform scale up of cost effectiveness, scenarios? Yes, I mean, I think that as we started to build the ship as we fly it, or build the plane as we fly it, some of the CEAs have been more opportunistic than others. And so sometimes it informs one specific program. Other times it actually contributes to a broader body of literature and can really push us in one direction over another. So just as an example of, I think, where data has helped to inform and scale up cost effectiveness scenarios, the IRC had a very large around $70 million education program that took place in a few countries in the Middle East. And we conducted analysis on that to be able to understand what effect different potential sub-interventions could be most effective within that, and also what they cost. And as part of that work, from the very beginning, when we first kind of crunched the numbers, it was looking to be about $155 per student reached or per child reached for that program. And we think in keeping with similar amounts of effectiveness as that $155 would have accomplished, we were able to reduce costs to $55 per child reached. And for that program, that ultimately translated to about, we think, based on the attribution that we would directly suggest for our contribution to that, around 400,000 more children reached that might have otherwise been possible by conducting that sort of analysis. So we think there's a lot of scope for that. We don't think that that's always the case, and we also have limited capacity, which is why we really keep CEAs for when effectiveness is a big question. And we also try to be strategic about where we focus our own time and energy on larger projects or projects with the most interesting questions.
I think the next cost is about shared costs. So I'm just going to go ahead and put a reply in the chat about definition of shared costs and how we deal with these. The portion of costs that are spread across the entire program in a certain country is brought into the analysis as a proportion of the total direct costs analyzed in the analysis compared to total direct costs within the budget. And if Justin, you'd like to add anything onto that, please feel free.
No, thanks, Michaela. Tom had a question about marginal cost and cost effectiveness versus average cost effectiveness. It's a great question. And I think we do look at that for some of the work that we do. So it just depends. For any sort of project that we would conduct, the first thing that we would want to do is actually work with country programs or with the implementer to understand what are the questions, what are the relevant questions in their mind, and then also think about the larger body of evidence and what a broader research agenda might suggest for what sort of questions that we want to answer. And in some instances, marginal costs might be a really useful and important question to answer, and one that we would want to look into more. So I think of course, like a really clear example of that is if there is a program that can be operating either at different scales, or you could think about marginal cost in terms of duration of a program as well. So thinking about, should we run a 2-year program or a 5-year program? That is oftentimes highly relevant and a significant cost driver and something that we would look into. Okay, so there's a question from Jesse on sensitivity analyses. So I think, oh, and then we sort of answered it. Okay, great. Sorry, reading as I'm going through these. Yeah, I think that there is more to be done on the sensitivity analysis front. I don't think we've cracked the nut on that, and a lot of it does exist outside of Dioptra. For Monte Carlo simulations, that could certainly be really useful. It could also perhaps, depending on what we're looking at, not be necessarily like the most relevant way to identify cost drivers. So it just depends on kind of what we're looking at, but I think it's a really good flag. So Christine had a question for how the IRCs use cost findings to influence our organization's activity structure or implementation. One thing that we've done is related to something I just mentioned. I'm thinking about program duration. So to the degree possible, we are both advocating to donors and additionally encouraging our organization's own kind of implementation to be thinking about how or whether it is possible to be able to develop like longer term programming. One of the major cost drivers, as you saw from Michaela's presentation, can be the sort of like system startup costs and really getting things going. And additionally, when you think about outputs or outcomes, year one is oftentimes really just a ramp up period. And so much of our work is, as I'm sure is for this will resonate with everyone on this call, is really piecemeal and split up into small projects with short time periods. And to the degree that we are able to work with either our country programs and our staff, and as well with those who ultimately give us the guidelines and the goalposts for project durations, encourage kind of longer term programming to be able to ultimately reduce some of the cost inefficiency or cost ineffectiveness that results from short-term projects. There's a question from Lainey on capital investments. Michaela, do you have an answer for this? I can also jump in if.
I guess I would say if the capital investment is a project specific or specific to the program that we're implementing, then we treat that as a direct program cost. And we go through the process of allocations. I think you saw that in one of Justin's slides when he had a segment where we could indicate the percent of that cost towards the outcome that we're evaluating. At that point, we would indicate in Dioptra the percent that we would anticipate contributed to the outcome we're evaluating. If for some reason the capital investment is a shared cost, then we would deal with that as shared costs, as I included earlier in the chat, as the ratio of direct program costs that were analyzed in the analysis.
Great. Eric made a great point about geographic concentration. Eric, that's actually one of the kind of suggestions or outcomes of the analysis that I mentioned in the Middle East education program, was to have slightly more concentrated implementation. So I think that's a really good point. Useful comment from Marcus. So Liz has a question on who should consider joining the Dioptra Consortium, what they should expect to give and get in return for their participation. Great question, Liz. So right now, historically, we've been a consortium of 9 kind of large implementing organizations, or large-ish. And I think that for any organization that fits that bill, there's a clear kind of fit with Dioptra, because that's an entity that would be conducting cost efficiency analyses, and that could benefit from the same sorts of questions that those within the consortium have. As part of joining the Dioptra Consortium, there would be kind of a ramp-up period whereby we would, and the Dioptra staff would provide more intensive support to be able to conduct cost efficiency analyses, and then the consortium member would also either would be hopefully expected to use the Dioptra tool to conduct cost efficiency analyses. I think that a lot of the future about Dioptra, though, is uncertain, and that's kind of exciting. I don't think it's necessarily the case that all Dioptra members in the future will be fitting the bill of a large implementing organization. It could be that there is an opportunity for researchers to get involved. I think we are really interested in what it would mean for multilateral organizations to be able to start using Dioptra as well, and for us to consider whether there's an opportunity for Dioptra to be more and more a part of kind of the funder conversation as well. So for example, right now we have a partnership with USAID to be able to work with them for Dioptra to be able to conduct more cost efficiency analyses than we would otherwise be able to conduct. And that's something that we're really excited about, and will definitely kickstart a lot of the analyses conducted at different organizations. Just to get nitty gritty as well, right now we are operating with a sort of kind of like freemium model. Historically, IRC has been able to subsidize all of Dioptra's costs, and we're shifting in a direction where, as different organizations and members get value out of Dioptra, and also ramp up the number of analyses, that there's essentially kind of a membership subscription cost associated with that. I would encourage all of you to go to dioptratool.org to click around and learn more about Dioptra. There are some really excellent 1 to 5 minute long walkthrough videos that you can view there to see what it looks like more in action, and as well some more information on how to join or how to reach out. And I'll also go ahead and shift to this next slide to share Michaela and I's information there. Miha had a question on, oh, sorry, Michaela's answered that. Thank you. Thanks for jumping in, Michaela, on some of this. So Elena had a question on indirect costs and whether they're included in the analysis. Yes, they are. And in general, we follow a pretty standard kind of ingredients methodology that has been used, that IRC did not invent, and that has been used by a lot of folks for a long time. The default for indirect costs is that they would be equivalent to the percentage of the programmatic implementation costs to the total costs of a program. So let me get specific about that, just so that you understand. So if there's a cash transfer program and it costs $5 for that program, but the total program costs are $10, we would attribute 50% of all the indirect costs associated with that grant to that program. However, that is just the default. There might be reasons why that actually doesn't make sense in practice. And I think that gets a lot to the point that Neha made around needing cost experts to be working with others to be able to actually have a conversation around what indirect costs are attributable. Because as much as we would love for this to be purely and entirely clear and completely automated, oftentimes there is nuance and some qualitative assessment that needs to go into this. Jeff had a question on whether you can adjust discount rates as part of the tool. Michaela, do you know, as part of Dioptra?
As part of Dioptra, I'm not quite certain. Typically, we start introducing that. Most of the programs that we're analyzing in Dioptra, if they're within a year period, we're not going to be introducing discount rates. However, if they extend beyond that, then we would. But we would have to get back to you on how that's done in Dioptra specifically.
Yeah, it's a great question.
So I know it looks like we're running a little bit low on time. I'm really excited about this. It seems like it's really generated some great discussion. And I'm not sure we'll be able to get through all these questions in this time. I guess Justin and Michaela, are you open to people emailing you, I guess, if they have follow-up questions about some of these?
Yes, please. Yeah, this has been an incredible list of questions. I know we're struggling to get through them all, so would love for folks to email us.
This has been great. I think this is exactly what we want from some of these brown bag lunches, is really this sort of discussion. So very excited for everyone who can make it. And thank you again to the presenters for an awesome presentation. I did want to mention to everyone that the Dioptra website itself actually has like a very good sort of explanation about some of the nitty-gritties of the tool. So I can share that also with the recording. And yeah, just want to say thank you all. It's very exciting to hear about what's going on.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all today. Excellent questions, and looking forward to continuing the conversation.
Perfect. Thank you all. Have a good day.